Welcome to the 8th and final part in our Anita Sarkeesian vs. Humanity series, our critique of Anita's own tropes vs. women in video game series. We have shown how a series that had the pretense of helping the gaming industry be more welcoming to women failed completely in its task, because it was pushing an extremist feminist agenda instead. In the entire Tropes vs. Women series, I could detect only very few legitimate criticisms, where I've agreed that the gaming industry can and should improve. But even in those cases, Anita's proposed solutions were absolutely ridiculous. In today's episode I shall focus on this aspect, show why Anita fails to offer practical solutions, and offer my own suggestions on how improvements can be achieved. One thing that Anita talks about is what is known as the Smurfette principle. In the TV show The Smurfs, there are about 100 different Smurfs, and each of them has his own unique characteristic by which he is identified. When it comes to Smurfette, her unique characteristic is that she is a female, since every other Smurf is male. Instead of having multiple female characters with different traits, femaleness itself is made into a trait. Anita recognizes this principle in many video games, and claims that this prevents female gamers from identifying with the characters that they are playing. This is fair criticism. Femaleness should not be the defining trait of a character. Female characters should have other traits or they become just flat caricatures. Where Anita loses me is when she starts talking about what the Smurfette principle says about our society.
In a male-identified society like ours, men are associated and become synonymous with human beings in general. In other words, male tends to be seen as the default for the entire species. In video games, male identification manifests as a tendency for all characters to be male by default, unless there's some special reason or specific justification for women to be present in the story.
So Anita sees this as a reflection of Western society as a whole, which she portrays as a society in which men are the default. This would have been largely true in the past, when men were indeed perceived as the driving force of human society, culture and history, and women as merely their companions. But this has changed in the past century, and today we do not see men as the default. Of course, in some places the change is slower, and one of those places is action games, where it is assumed that the player is male, so the protagonists are male by default. And this assumption is based on the fact that traditionally it was boys who enjoyed action. This tradition is gradually changing, and we see more girls get into action, which also causes a gradual change in which we see more female protagonists in action movies and games. But Anita disregards this historical process. For her, the idea that men are the default is intrinsic to the patriarchal Western culture, and there's no chance it will change as long as the patriarchy exists. This is yet another widespread feminist trope. The idea is that anyone who isn't white and male is screwed in the entertainment industry, because we are programmed to identify with the white male protagonist. So anyone who isn't a white male has to struggle to get to the top. However, a quick look at the history of cinema will refute this, and show that white males are also subject to the same processes as everyone else. Take white male British actors, for instance. Hollywood always had high regard for British actors, but still had a problem casting them as the protagonists. Since America was the biggest market, Hollywood usually casted American actors in the roles that the viewer is supposed to identify with, knowing that the American crowd had a problem identifying with the Brits. The British actors were usually relegated to secondary or antagonist roles. One good example is the 1960 movie Spartacus, where the slaves are the good guys and are all played by American actors, while the Romans are the bad guys and are all played by British actors. As late as the 1980s, when the movie Labyrinth was made, the producers casted the American Jennifer Connelly to play the role of the protagonist Sarah, even though she was British in the book. The British flavor was provided by David Bowie, who played the antagonist Goblin King. But things eventually changed, and when the Harry Potter movies were made, the producers felt confident enough to cast only British actors in the leading roles. By that time, American audiences had no problem identifying with them. This is what Anita fails to understand. Game developers have to create heroes that the intended customers will identify with. You can't impose on the gamers a hero that they do not identify with, and hope that it will somehow break the conditioning and make them identify with this hero. Changing traditions is a gradual process, and you have to work within this process. There are ways in which art can help this process, which we shall shortly discuss. First, however, let's talk some more about Anita's misguided views on this subject. Anita makes a big fuss over what she calls the damsel in distress trope. In many action games, the female characters find themselves in distress and have to be saved by the male hero. The opposite case, in which a heroine gets to save a dude in distress, is rare. The male characters are expected to save themselves. According to Anita, this is part of the cultural conditioning that makes us regard women as dependent on men, and not masters of their own fate.
Let's compare the damsel to the archetypal hero myth, in which a typically male character may occasionally also be harmed, incapacitated, or briefly imprisoned at some point during their journey. In these situations, the character relies on their intelligence, cunning, and skill to engineer their own escape.
That's better.
Or, just punching a hole in the prison wall works too. The point is, they're ultimately able to gain back their own freedom. In fact, that process of overcoming the ordeal is an important step in the protagonist's transformation into a heroic figure. A damseled woman, on the other hand, is shown as incapable of escaping the predicament on her own, and then must wait for a savior to come and do it for her. In this way, the damsel's ordeal is not her own. Instead, it's framed as a trial for the hero to overcome. Consequently, the trope robs women in peril from the opportunity of being the architects of their own escape, and therefore prevents them from becoming archetypal heroes themselves.
Let's explore the history of this trope. In the past, society tried to protect women from violence, war, and politics, which were seen as burdens for men to carry. Men took care to not even speak about this stuff in the presence of women. So women were not expected to know how to deal with this kind of situations, but rather to rely on men to protect them. And we have a long tradition of damsel in distress stories as a result. If we go back just 100 years, to the silent film era, we can still see it. In the Buster Keaton movie The General, released in 1926, the hero saves a damsel in distress, but during their escape she gets her leg caught in a bear trap. He releases her from the trap, but then gets caught in it himself. She then does nothing to help him, but just sits around and whines about her own pain, leaving him to work his way out of the trap himself. When I saw this scene for the first time, it felt very strange to me, since I don't expect women to behave like that, certainly not if they are positive characters in a movie. And I felt that way because society has changed, and women today behave differently in this type of situations. Well, I guess Anita wouldn't, but most women would try to help the man and not be so self-centered. And yet, it is still usually the men who save the women in action movies and games, not the other way around. Why is that? Is it because men run the industry and want to preserve this trope, like Anita seems to believe? Or is it due to other reasons? Let's talk a little bit about what women like. The thing that caused the biggest excitement among girls in recent years was the Twilight Saga, both the books and the movies. The story is about a girl protagonist who is caught in a love triangle with two very powerful and heroic boys. Bella does have agency. She takes control over her own fate, but she is still very much a damsel who needs the protection of her male friends. Another popular saga was The Hunger Games, which has a similar premise of a girl protagonist caught in a love triangle with two heroic boys, although here she is much stronger and can usually take care of herself. It is telling that The Hunger Games did not create the same amount of hysteria among girls that Twilight did, and on the other hand was a lot more popular with the boys. What it tells us is that it is mainly the girls who are keeping the damsel in distress trope alive. Yes, girls today are more independent and want female characters that reflect that independence, but they are also still turned on by the thought of a Prince Charming that will come and save them, a big strong man who can protect them. We don't know if this is something intrinsic to human nature, or just a cultural construct, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that this is the psychological makeup of today's humans. Both men and women enjoy damsel in distress stories. The main objective of the storyteller is to tell a good story, and a good story must bring into account the psychology of its audience. If you want to use art to bring cultural change, you have to work within this frame, to present the audience with something familiar that they can identify with and enjoy, and on top of that add something subversive. Let's take one example from the history of cinema that shows how this can be done. Let's go back to the time when Italian Americans were the other of American society. What made them other, besides the regular problems of immigrant cultures, was the family structure. While Americans saw themselves as a nation of individuals, living in small nuclear families and loyal to themselves and to the flag, Italian Americans were loyal mainly to their families, which were quite extended. Based on this loyalty, the mafia families could run their operations and be a real menace to American society. In 1969, Mario Puzo published his novel The Godfather, which presented the first look into the inner workings of the Cosa Nostra. When Paramount Pictures turned this book into a movie in 1972, they've decided to gamble and let a young Italian-American director, Francis Ford Coppola, a shot at making it. Coppola, on his part, wanted to use the opportunity to show Italian-American culture, and its struggle to fit into the American way of life. He also wanted to use mainly Italian-American actors, and he informed the studio that he found two wonderful young actors to play the roles of Don Corleone's sons. For the part of the elder brother Sonny, he wanted Robert De Niro, and for the young brother Michael, he wanted Al Pacino. The executives were like, "What's that? Pacino and De Niro? Those are not names of movie actors, my man. Actors in leading roles have names like Robert Redford and Paul Newman." In the end, they settled on a mix of familiar movie stars and unknown Italian actors, and it was proven to be a winning mix, which gave the audience enough to identify with while also giving the Corleone family the feel of an authentic Italian-American family. And through the Corleone family, Coppola could show Italian-American culture to the masses, and get the American audience more familiar with it. In the wake of The Godfather, the 1970s became the decade of the Italian-American heroes in Hollywood. On the one hand, there were outsiders trying to make it in America, which made them interesting characters. On the other hand, the audience could identify with them, because they were fighting against two common enemies. First, they were fighting against the system, which was hated and suspected in the post-Vietnam and Watergate era. Secondly, there were white guys fighting against African Americans, the real other. Whether it was on the dance floor, in the boxing ring or on the streets, those Italian-American heroes had to show that they can hold their own against the blacks. Thus, Hollywood helped the integration of Italian-Americans into American society, getting the American public to stop thinking of them as other, and start thinking of them as part of the nation. After that, casting Italian-American actors in leading roles or showing scenes of Italian family life became a normal thing, and thus progress was achieved. So social progress is achieved through an evolutionary, incremental process. Anita actually talks about it as evolution at one point.
The good news is that there's nothing stopping developers from evolving their gender representations and making more women heroes in their future games.
But she doesn't try to understand how this evolution is achieved. If these were the 1970s, she would surely deride movies for perpetuating Italian-American stereotypes and for otherizing African Americans. And because she has that mentality, she can't see the progress made even around the damsel in distress trope. Damsel in distress stories are still used because they are familiar and enjoyable to us, but they are told in a different manner, a manner that gives increasingly more agency to the female characters. Anita does recognize that, but it doesn't matter to her. As we've discussed in part 1, Anita doesn't care about the changing context. She sees the gamers as creatures devoid of reason, affected only by the conditioning of the system. So if a female character is in distress at one point in the game, even if that character is otherwise capable and independent, that's enough in Anita's opinion to reinforce the image of women as hapless and helpless. This is a recurring problem in all of Anita's analyses. Take, for instance, the trope that she calls the sinister seductress.
These representations are often defended because they're rooted in storytelling traditions that date back for thousands of years. But for as long as it has existed, misogyny has been reinforced by the stories that cultures have told themselves. Myths, legend, folktales, and religious teachings have been used as tools to contribute to the oppression of women for millennia. When games today uncritically employ such representations, they aren't tapping into some intrinsic truth of human existence. They're doing what stories involving such characters have always done, perpetuating false notions that women are inherently misleading and manipulative, and that female sexuality is something to be shamed, feared, and controlled.
Anita is correct that this is a trope that is rooted in ancient folklore, but when she says that the games are just doing the same thing as the ancient stories, she is once again completely disregarding the context. First of all, this trope is rooted not just in history but also in our biology, which makes men feel a strong attraction to sexy women. In the past, this temptation was perceived as something that comes from the devil, and so women's sexuality and women overall were described as the devil's agents. We still feel that attraction, but in today's culture we no longer describe it as something evil. The sinister seductress is now no more than a part of a stock of archetypal villains that our culture amassed, and which game developers sometimes use. To show that nothing has changed, Anita would have to show that video games promote the notion that female sexuality is sinister in itself, and she fails to produce any evidence of that. Let's circle back to our discussion on 1970s Hollywood. As mentioned, when you had an Italian American as the protagonist, African Americans were often the antagonists, and none more so than Apollo Creed, the main antagonist of the first two Rocky movies. By the 1980s, however, Hollywood evolved further, and started to feature African American protagonists. Creed could then become a hero, someone that the audience already knew and could root for. That's how the evolution is achieved. When you have a group that is other, and the viewers can't identify with them, you introduce them first as the antagonists, and accentuate their otherness to make them more interesting and exotic. That makes the audience want to see more of them, and after a while, it starts to get familiar with them, and then you can gradually turn them into protagonists, first as token figures, and eventually as the main heroes. This works even with fictional groups. Vampires and Klingons were featured so many times that we became intimately familiar with their fictional world, and eventually we wanted to see them as protagonists. Again, this is the only way to achieve progress in this matter. But there would be no progress if we listened to Anita, because we would never be able to introduce the new identities, and to start bridging the cultural gap. For Anita, as she reiterates a number of times, introducing someone as exotic is a form of racism, and should be avoided.
Scenarios like these are part of a long racist tradition of representing women of color as mysterious and hypersexual creatures who exist as an exotic spice to be consumed by the white or Western man.
So, how can progress be achieved, according to Anita? In what ways can art evolve, and help us evolve? We can suss it out from one segment in which Anita complains about the fact that violent games always contain violence against women.
This dominant narrative surrounding the inevitability of female objectification and victimhood is so powerful that it not only defines our concepts of reality, but it even sets the parameters for how we think about entirely fictional worlds, even those taking place in the realms of fantasy and science fiction. It's so normalized that when these elements are critiqued, the knee-jerk response I hear most often is that if these stories did not include the exploitation of women, then the game world would feel too unrealistic or not historically accurate. What does it say about our culture when games routinely bend or break the laws of physics and no one bats an eye? When dragons, ogres, and magic are inserted into historically influenced settings without objection? We're perfectly willing to suspend our disbelief when it comes to multiple lives, superpowers, health regeneration, and the ability to carry dozens of weapons in a massive invisible backpack. But somehow, the idea of a world without sexual violence and exploitation is deemed too strange and too bizarre to be believable. The truth is that objectification and sexual violence are neither normal nor inevitable. We do not have to accept them as some kind of necessary cultural backdrop in our media stories. Contrary to popular belief, the system of patriarchy has not existed for all of history across all time and all cultures, and as such, it can be changed. It is possible to imagine fictional worlds, even of the dark, twisted dystopian variety, where the oppression and exploitation of women is not framed as something expected and inevitable. When we see fictional universes challenging or even transcending systemic gender oppression, it subverts the dominant paradigm within our collective consciousness and helps make a more just society feel possible, tangible, and within reach.
There we have it. For Anita, the way to achieve progress is to present a portrait of how things should be, and that will make the gamers' minds evolve. This goes back to what we've discussed in part 5, where we showed that Anita believes that we are born as a blank slate, and we can be molded in any way that our culture molds us. So the current gender roles and characteristics, in Anita's view, are not something that evolved over time, but something that was once created, and since then we are living in the same paradigm. That is why she doesn't acknowledge the progress that has been achieved. For her, it's all the same paradigm. The only meaningful change in her mind is a change that will bring gender relations utopia, and she believes that that can easily be achieved. All we have to do is condition the minds of humans to think in the correct way, and utopia will transpire. So Anita calls it evolving, but this is not evolutionary thinking. Evolution is achieved by taking an existing material and reshaping it, not by erasing everything that came before and creating something new. What should we call Anita's worldview then? Well, I believe we have a perfect word to define it. This is creationism, the belief that you can magically create a new universe from scratch. Feminist creationism is the belief that gender roles did not evolve but were decided by a single act of creation, and it wants us to have another act of creation to fix it. And this is the worldview that is manifested in Anita's criticism of video games. And that is why she is bound to fail. The feminist creationist attempt to reshape pop culture is just as futile and pathetic as the religious creationist attempt to reshape science. A movement that disregards human nature cannot possibly get anywhere. Feminism is now in vogue in Hollywood and other corners of pop culture, but this creationist attitude will bring it down very quickly. The market is just going to laugh off any attempt to create pieces according to the unintelligent design of the creationist feminists, and that will be the end of it. My final message to gamers, therefore, is that you shouldn't worry too much about Anita. She is just the latest in a long line of sanctimonious culture guardians who try to censor art, and she's one of the most pathetic specimens in that line. Her more formidable predecessors did some damage, but ultimately failed to stop art from being made, so she really doesn't stand a chance. We should actually be thankful to Anita for being such a terrible scholar that she exposes the intellectual shortcomings of today's feminism. She's not going to have much of an effect on the gaming world, but she will help us to faster rid our culture of feminist creationism. We've mentioned The Godfather, and the trials it had to go before it got made. There were other problems it had to face. The early 70s, when it was made, were the years after Hollywood's code of production collapsed, and movie makers stopped censoring themselves when it came to showing scenes of sex and violence. The Godfather was one of a number of films that became infamous at the time for the excessive violence featured in them. In Britain, that brought a backlash in the form of the National Viewers and Listeners Association, a group headed by Mary Whitehouse, the 1970s Anita Sarkeesian. Whitehouse was driven not by feminism but by Christian conservative views, but her goals were pretty much the same. She wanted to clean up the entertainment industry from what she regarded to be aspects that are unhealthy to a wholesome society. Looking back though, the damage that she and the group did was minimal. The movies that were attacked at the time are now considered classics, and censorship is weaker than it was back then. Watching The Godfather today, we are reminded that great art will always triumph. So before I go, I would like to thank Anita for being such a perfect exemplar of everything that is wrong with today's feminism, allowing me to summarize it all in one project. So thank you, Anita. I wish you all the best, and I hope that your first child be a masculine child.